Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is March 14th, 2023. Now let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So, Bakhmut, currently the situation is not good at all. Zelensky held a meeting today with the Supreme Commander in Chief Staff, and the decision was made to continue defending Bakhmut. And they're confident that they can continue defending Bakhmut. But overall, as you can see in this image, is that the Wagner units are currently inside the Azom plant, which was the metalworks where Zelensky visited the defenders in Bakhmut a few months ago to show his support in the defense of the city. So now the Wagner units are in control or partial control of this plant. So they're inching closer and closer every day towards Bakhmut. So the situation is not looking good at all. And so from what I see is that the Ukrainian forces will continue defending. And they're just slowly retreating back, inflicting as much damage as possible to the Russian units. They see an opportunity here to really destroy some of the more elite Russian forces, even though Wagner usually sends, the first wave or the second wave of attack, the convicts. They still have, as you can see here, well-armed units that then do the final assault where they can easily capture terrain because of the exhaustion, defense exhaustion that the Ukrainians undergo as they have to constantly fend off these waves of infantry attacks. So overall, it's not looking good. Let's take a look at the map as well. Just going to switch over to the map here. And you can see that the last few days, the Russians have really gained a lot of ground in the south of Bakhmut. Actually, looking backwards in the timeline, you can see that a few days ago, this is the way it looked like. So there was still some fighting just outside of the city, but now the Russians managed to get close within certain blocks in the south. So overall here, it's not looking great. The Ukrainians now are defending, kind of the outside of the city center. And I believe where the metalworks plant was somewhere around here in the north, where there's more of an industrial area, as you can see here. So this is currently where the fighting is ongoing. And so I believe the Russians are in control of this area right here. And this is where the metalworks is. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that's where it is. And so overall, what the Ukrainians are going to do within the next couple of days, maybe a week or two, is that they're going to continue retreating until obviously the Russians capture Bakhmut. I really believe that the Ukrainians did their best to defend Bakhmut, and that the city served its purpose, and that is to fend off this major offensive that the Russians started in January, end of January. And it really slowed them down. There's now reports that the Russians are lacking ammunition. They cannot build as much artillery rounds as they need in order to continue their offensive, and it's really slowed down the Russians. Bakhmut was another Mariupol for the Russians, where they, strategically speaking, it's not a city that really meant a lot, but it had symbolic importance. So that's why the Russians went all in here, because they needed a victory. And so that, I believe, was a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians, and that they're not going to be able to continue on their major offensive as we saw last year in March and April and May. So that's the current situation. You can see as well that the Russians the last few days have also managed to push in the north a little bit on this highway close to Berkhivka, Orikhovo-Vasilievka. So this highway that leads into Slovyansk. So this is the main goal. These are the last two major cities in Donbass that the Ukrainians control, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. But I seriously doubt that the Russians are going to be able to push as far as these two cities. And even if they were able to do so, the amount of time it took them to take a city of 80,000 people, yeah, it's a city, it's a lot of people, but it's still small compared to the gains that the Russians were able to get in taking Mariupol, Kherson, right, in the early phase of the war. I can't see them taking Kramatorsk in a week. It's going to be another year, if the Ukrainians don't manage to do any counteroffensive, for them to take Kramatorsk, if not even more. So there's no chance for them after Bakhmut to pull off any major successful capture of major towns and cities in Ukraine, in my humble opinion. So that's the situation in Bakhmut. Expect within the next week or two, I believe, a Ukrainian retreat from here, unless by some chance the Ukrainians pull off a really great counteroffensive here, but that's not going to happen because we all know that the spring thaw is here, and it doesn't make sense to pull off an offensive right now. And the Ukrainians are saving it for end of April, maybe early May. Apart from that, the same old situation in Kremina. The Russians are having no success in pushing here. They continue launching multiple attacks, and they're constantly failing. So in the north, nothing really has changed. And in the south, you guys know that the Russians have had a catastrophic loss in Vuhledar. And I haven't mentioned it before, but why is Vuhledar so important for the Russians? It's first of all, well, the Russians launched in the early phase of the war a massive attack in Volnovakha, which is where there was a major railway line, the only railway line that connected the south of Ukraine to Crimea. And so now they need to continue extending their control because the Ukrainians still have fire control over Volnovakha and the railway lines. Even if they are not usable, railway lines are usually easy to repair or build, right? And so for the Ukrainians, it's very easy targets if the Russians somehow manage to push railway their train cars here, right? So for them, Vuhledar is also important to extend their control over the territory in Donbass, but also because this specific area holds a lot of coal. Vuhl in Ukraine means coal. So this entire area here is a large basin that has not basin, but a large area that contains a lot of coal, which is also very important for the Ukrainians for their energy production. So this explains why the Russians, earlier in October pushed in Pavlivka, and now are trying to take at all costs Vuhledar. And in my next slide, I'll show you as well what type of losses they've had the last few days as well. So overall, that's the situation. Also, Avdiivka, the Russians continue pushing here. Let's take a look at their gains the last few days. You can see that this highway here that is right beside Kamyanka, Krasnohorivka, the Russians have gotten some control over this road here, this highway. And so you can see that the Russians are also trying to pull off an encirclement of Avdiivka, which has been pulverized the same way as Bakhmut, the same way as Marinka. I've shown you pictures of the city that has been absolutely destroyed by the Russians. But yet again, the Russians are trying to continue their small little pushes on different fronts. So I'll keep you guys updated the next few days again as to what is going to be happening in all these different fronts that the Russians have opened up. So let's get back to the main slides. And so my next slide is very telling of this Vuhledar failed offensive in Vuhledar. So this is a diary of a Russian officer that was captured in Vuhledar a few days ago. And you can see here that this is pretty much, a tab that he was keeping on the soldiers that he was sending on frontal attacks and how many of them were coming back. And so you can see here that on March 1st, 100 soldiers were sent for an assault and only 16 remained. March 3rd, 116 soldiers were sent and only 23 remained. March 4th, 103 soldiers were sent and only 15 remained. And on March 5th, which probably was the worst casualties they got, was 115 soldiers were sent and only 3 remained, came back. You can see here Obstanovka, which is the current situation. And guys, the Russians are doing the exact same thing over and over and over again, and they're expecting some sort of a different outcome. We've seen this multiple times on different fronts. Even with Bakhmut, they continue sending, and it's the worst, especially in Vuhledar, because it's so open, right? There's no forests, it's very open fields, and so the Ukrainians are pretty much doing turkey shoot on the Russians, right? Because they're so visible, and they're expecting a different outcome. And to this day, we still haven't seen the Russians pull off a successful combined arms operation in Ukraine, right? Where their air force, their infantry, even their navy, their artillery are all working together to pull off a successful attack somewhere. Perhaps in the early phase of the war, we could have seen hints of that, in Kiev and Kharkiv, but eventually they all failed because the Russians couldn't pull it off. Also the logistics. So overall, this is very telling to why the Russians are just not going to win this battle and this war. They don't learn from their mistakes. They might learn a little bit, but it's not enough for them to completely alter the way that they fight against Ukraine. The Ukrainians have managed to always show an ability to transform, to adapt to different situations. It's not quick. There's a lot of issues within the Ukrainian army. Let's not lie that the Ukrainian army is perfect and that, you know, there's no issues whatsoever, because the same issues are also happening in terms of the logistics, the training, the leadership, right? There are things that are at fault here as well, and why sometimes there's failed offensives and defenses on the Ukrainian side. But the Russians cannot win this battle exactly because of this this picture. It's very telling. Now, this is just a quick image of the border between Belarus and Poland. So you can see that Poland, a year later, has absolutely closed off every single entrance. I believe almost all of them. I think they kept a few of them, but from what I understand, this is the border between Belarus and Poland, and so you can see concrete barriers, anti-tank barriers as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some mines in here as well. So you can see that obviously there's no trust anymore between Belarus and Poland, and as it should be. Belarus was a country that allowed the Russians to get into Ukraine, and by default allowed the Russians to commit all of these atrocities. The Belarus government was just as much implicated into this battle, this brutal battle that is currently ongoing, as Putin's regime, the Russian government. So unfortunately, that's the fate for the Belarus people as well, because they haven't stood up against Lukashenko. I can only hope that one day, next few months, we're going to see the same type of protests we saw in 2020 when millions of Belarusian people came out to protest against Lukashenko's rigged elections. But so far, I haven't seen any of that happening, unfortunately. And last but not least, guys, this is images from Moscow, and you can see here that the paranoia is setting in for Putin. So I know some of you guys are also saying that this is also for propaganda purposes, showing to the people that, look, the Ukrainians are about to take Moscow, they're about to attack Russia, and you need to be more engaged and fighting against NATO and Ukraine. But I also think it's Putin's paranoia setting in. We've seen him set up all of these bases, these anti-air defense systems, even in areas where people believe he has his mansions and his cottages all throughout Russia. So Putin is paranoid. He's afraid, especially because the Ukrainians have last few weeks flown UAVs, long-distance UAVs, very close to Moscow and even in St. Petersburg. And so obviously you can see all this deforestation that has been happening in Moscow is basically Putin setting up all these, military camps and anti-air defense sections within the city because he's just absolutely paranoid that somehow the Ukraine is going to launch a UAV attack somewhere on administrative buildings or somewhere where he's sitting in the bunker in the Kremlin. Who knows? But definitely this is not a show of confidence to the Russian people whatsoever for a war that they were supposed to win, even being generous, in less than a month, right? And now look at what they're doing now. And so here, after the New Year holidays, according to this article, the tree removal began in several districts of Moscow. Anti-aircraft missile systems, such as the S-400, radars, as well as combat control points, have already been deployed in the Elk Island National Park, on the experimental fields of Timiryazev Agricultural Academy, and also hundreds of hectares of forests were cut down in the Kolomenskoye Museum Reserve. So obviously, guys, imagine if you're walking in Yosemite or Banff National Park or whatever, and you're seeing these air defense systems being set up. It's outrageous, but that's the Russian way. That's the way they do it. They like destroying things, and I guess we're all used to seeing these types of pictures. So that's the video for today, guys. Let me know what you think about Bakhmut, about my comments. Do you expect the Ukrainians to pull off a retreat the next few days, if not a week or two? And I will see you guys in the next video. So take care, and I will see you soon.